This is the standard 50mm f2.8 Retina-Xenar lens off a Kodak Retina Reflex S. The same lens was also common to the Retina 3S and be compatible with the Retina Reflex 3 or the Retina Reflex 4 or even the Instamatic Reflex. So this needs to be serviced. The focus is a little bit stiff. It's smooth, doesn't feel gritty, but it's a little bit stiff. Servicing the camera so the lens gets done at the same time. So I thought I'd show you how I go about taking one of these things apart. First of all, you start at the front, and the name ring at the front here is retained in with this black conical section here, and typically that'll come off using a friction tool like this. It's loosened it, I think. Yes. So the name ring comes off, and we'll pop those pieces aside. And here we have the lens capsule in the mount. So that's held in with 3 screws here and washers. And the lens capsule should be able to be removed from the mount. Let's have a quick look at the lens capsule. Well, there's a big smudge on the front of that glass element. I expect that'll all clean off. It looks just like fingerprints to me. Here we have the focus helical, and that's quite smooth, but it's a little bit stiff. That'll have to have the grease removed, and when it's all clean, fresh lubricant in there. I'll check the action of the diaphragm. That's snappy. Doesn't appear to be any problem there. I'll pop that to one side, and we can be dealing with the mount. So this comes apart. There are 4 screws at the rear. Excuse me. As I was saying before, I was rudely interrupted by the door. 4 screws. There's a fly buzzing around in this room. I hate flies. I'll have to stop and deal with that in a second. Alright, I'm going to take the thing to bits. That's the back. Now, you need to take great care to notice the order you take stuff off. And normally I would stack them one on top of another so that the order is correct for reassembly. So I've unhooked that spring. This small cam, this dividing ring, and the other pointer. That's all the loose components from there. What we're left with, there's 4 screws here holding those small green tabs in. Those tabs actually hold the front, the focus ring, together with the body. This one here, because it's got the spring on it, is a bit awkward. I tend to leave that in place. I will remove the other 3. Hang on, a bit of chemical warfare. That'll sort that one out. This is very clean inside this lens, unusually clean. Generally speaking, there'll be much more dust and dirt to be seen. That fly is just going through its death throes now. This one here is pretty much trapped under that rail, so it just falls to the back and we leave it there. It can be tipped out and cleaned at this point. And there's our focus ring, and the main body is to be seen there. All I have to do really here is clean these, make sure I remove all traces of the old grease and all the dust and dirt that might be ingrained in it. And then we'll reassemble that with a bit of molybdenum paste. Well, with the lens all apart, all the components need to be cleaned. So what I normally do now is start with these components. Let's get this stuff out of the way. I'll just move these bits back out of the picture, so to speak. Alright, so I want to start with these components and clean them up using Ronsonol, which is lighter fluid for a cigarette lighter. Naphtha, I think it is. Probably has half a dozen other names. And all I'm doing here is removing all traces of the old grease and any accumulated dust and grit with it. When you're using solvents on something like this, be very aware of this plastic knob here. This particular solvent probably won't harm it, but I don't push my luck. Some solvents certainly would, and that would start going into a either a gooey mess, or it would go soft and you'd be left with a rough finish on it. So don't push your luck. Don't get any solvent on plastic unless you need to, and be sure you know what you're doing. Right, so I'm just cleaning these parts. This is all very clean, so I'm just not having to work very hard with this one at all. Normally I would be expecting to see an awful lot more accumulated filth and having to deal with it. So I'll get out the components I want here. Whoops, don't tip things over. These little wedge pieces are what holds it all together. They run inside that groove, and effectively that front focus ring is floating on those wedges, not rubbing much on this frame at all. Let's check that that's all clean. You can hardly see there for the dirt. I'll tip that piece of paper over. Let's find a cleaner face. That's a bit better. So now I need a little bit of molybdenum paste. Run it round inside this groove. Run some on that flat face there. It needs very little. Assemble these two components together. Oopsie, before I do that, need to slide one of these wedges into place underneath that little brass fence. That's it. Now assemble these two pieces together. There's an arrowhead here, that's the focus scale pointer, so as long as that's pointing to one of the numbers you're in the right position. Now I just hook that in so that this wedge is in the groove. This piece of course is turned around just to annoy me. That's better. I'll pop the others back in place. And do the screw up quite lightly. Let's spring out the way so I can see what I'm doing. There's the screw hole. Whoopsie. Get in there, you bugger. Just did that up very lightly indeed. Our last of the four goes in here. Now the idea with these 4 wedges is you want them pushed in evenly so that the ring is effectively floating, not scraping against any of the edges, which it will do if it's pushed to one side. So that feels quite good. This one post here with the spring on it, that's effectively our fixed post. So I'm just going to nip up the screw on the tab opposite it and just check this for rock. See if there's any feel of play there in that direction, and there is. So I know that haven't got that quite tight enough. I'm going to move that wedge in slightly, take up a bit of that slack. Check that it revolves smoothly. Check to see if there's any rock, and I've removed that rock. That's good. Now I'll nip up these other two, not the ones at 90 degrees to those ones, and just check those the same way. Check if there's any rock. There is a little bit. So I'm just looking at my spacing here and here to see which way they are. There's more of a gap over here. So if I'm going to push the wedge anywhere, it'll be on this side. And check again to see it's smooth. That's tight. That's too tight. I'm just checking my spacing. I'll back this one off very slightly. That's good. Now I'll check the rock, see if I feel any rocking movement in it. Just a little bit. Let's try closing that one up a bit. Now that feels good. I'm happy with the smoothness of that action, so I can nip those screws up. That part of the job is done. Pop that to one side. Here we have the lens mount section. This brass piece in here is the cam that would couple with the rangefinder on a Retina 3S. Now this is going back on a reflex, but we still need this action to be clean and smooth, because for all I know the owner has a Retina 3S sitting in the cupboard waiting to also use the same lens. The last versions of these lenses, which were made about the time they were the Instamatic Reflex or the Reflex Retina Reflex 4 were in production, lacked this cam. The Retina 3S by that stage had faded into obscurity, and not having been made for a considerable number of years. Just check that, wipe around this case. There's a bit of muck coming off there, so there's a bit of old grease needs to come out. That's good. And around the brass cam as well. Again, I'll use my molybdenum paste, and I'll just want a little smear up in here where it's going to fit into that case, and some on the inside face as well. And on the cam surface, I'll just give that a very light touch, just so that it would run smoothly over the pointer, the follower for the rangefinder on a Retina 3S, which is just the end, a rounded end of a very fine piece of rod for all practical purposes. And you don't want any extra friction there if you can help it. And now we're reassembling it. Just keeping an eye on the time here because I have to disappear out the door in 5 or 10 minutes to go and earn my living at my other job, which is repairing computers. And somebody has called upon my help because their computer will not get to the internet. And of course I'm hoping it will be a very simple task. Just check that that is smooth. That's good. It's smooth and it's got a little bit of drag from the tabs, and that lubricant helps. Just needs to be smooth. If it's absolutely dry, it can rattle, and it feels quite disconcerting when you're moving the focus if you get this rattle noise as it drags around. That's good. And pop that to one side. Back to looking at this. We can start reassembling this. So I'll start with a few of the pieces. All of these components need to be cleaned. Remove all traces of dirt and grease from them really. Otherwise they tend to stick. These broad flat surfaces, if they have any build-up of oil and grease on them, they'll tend to stick. The grease just doesn't want to shear, I suppose you'd say, as the components being rotated. We need them to be very light and easy to move. So I've got to pop the components back in. Alright, so pull this spring back out of the way. You've got to be very careful with those springs, they're quite delicate. This piece drops in. Make sure it drops over these gears. That spring needs to hook over that onto that tab, which is always awkward. That's it. Just check that that's all seated, and it's not. It's not sitting down here on that gear correctly, so there's something's a bit out of line. That's better, it's dropped into place. The spacing ring goes on next. There's a cut-out tab there which lines up with a little tab here. The spring needs to be hooked, is tucked under it at the moment. That needs to come out from there. It sits around the edge of that ring. The next component is that small cam. That little cam runs on this groove here, so I'm just running a little bit of molybdenum grease there to paste to deal with that, and this piece sits in there like that. And clean up the next piece. This is the second of the depth of field indicators. Drops in there and should align so that the pin on it, the pin on this cam drops into the slot. Like that. Is that lined up with the gear? Something's not sitting down in place. checking that for flatness. It's off, there's something wrong with it. Cam has dropped out of its groove, that's better. Okay, so here I'm checking that the two pointers are in the same position at the extremity of their travel in both cases. And if they're not, you need to move this one over so that it is. No, that's alright, that's correct. That's all good. The next component. Again, I'm wiping it with the Ronsonol just to make sure I've got any oil and filth off it. The pin on this section needs to drop down into that hole and that little cam there. Be careful not to get the spring tangled up in anything while you're doing this. That sits in there. That's set down into place neatly. Make sure that spring's free. That spring goes over the same post the other spring was attached to, like that. The two pointers are connected to the gears here, so they rotate in different directions. As you rotate, as you move that lever, it rotates them. This component. This is a shim or spacer. Making sure I get all the rubbish off that. That fits on right here. Now before I fit that, I've got some special screws to help me with the reassembly of that component. And all I need to do is lay my hands on them and the job will go much smoother. Some things are easier said than done. I'll be back when I've got them. Alright, I'm back. Let's carry on putting this thing together. As I think I was saying before, I was rudely interrupted by having to go out and do some computer work. I have some screws made up to help me line these components up. These are longer screws with the appropriate thread, and I've turned the heads off them so that they are just a shaft, no head for all practical purposes. Normally I put 3 of these in. You don't need anything too clever like a lathe to do things like this. You can, if you've got screws, you can stick them in the chuck of a drill and hold a file up there. That'll take them away. So that piece goes on there like that. The last piece here needs to be cleaned. These broad flat surfaces, they are a big problem if they get grease or oil on them, because they just stick, don't move at all. Right, make sure I've got this cut out in the right place, which should be there. Now here Here there's a little cutout in that piece. You might see it wiggling, moving there. Now that cutout couples to the cam, so we have to position that so we can find it. So I'm going to put it in line with that screw and swing my base around my lens mount so I know where it is, and my cutout needs to be over there, and lower this into place over those screws. Check that everything fell into place. Now, holding this firmly together with my fingers, I'm checking that the depth of field pointers run together, and they do. So holding that firmly together, I've got 3 of those butchered screws in there as guides. So one of the positions is empty, so I can put my first screw in there. I hope this is showing alright on the video. The weather's gone a bit miserable since I was last here, and it's quite dull, which means that even if the exposure is correct on the camera, very likely the depth of field is not the best. Right, I've got 2 in there holding that together. Let's check that everything works. That's good. And the pointers drop in, and that the focus is smooth. Replace the last 2 screws, and then the next task is to get the lens capsule back in. Oh, I suppose I could show you how I clean that lens first. And check that the cam is indeed coupled to the focus ring. That's good. So final tighten of those 4 screws. And the lens mount's all good. So back to this. Now there's nothing internally to see there. The diaphragm is clean, dry, behaving itself. So with a bit of glass cleaner on a cotton bud, I'm just doing these external surfaces. Just to remove any grease or fingerprints, smudges, things I don't want to be there. Get another cotton bud. That's very good. I'm very pleased with the state of that lens. Now we have to get it back into the mount. Now, here are 2 of these tabs. One couples to the depth of field pointers. That's spring loaded. You'll feel quite a spring tension on there. The other is not. Now this one, can you see it there? This one, that tab there, couples into here, into that position. I'm just getting a bit of molybdenum, just putting it into that tab, and here, this spot is where that runs on a post in the mount. So I'll put a drop on there, and now I've got to line the two up. This is always entertaining, but it can be done, otherwise I'd be in big trouble. So we've got to get these two tabs lined up. No, only got one of them in there, a fixed one. That's it. See, the diaphragm opens and closes. Now, I'm grabbing this with my fingers at the back to stop that falling back out. And I'm just going to pop that on there out of harm's way while I clean the other half of our helical mount. You can see the dirt coming out of there and old grease. I want all of that out. The old grease will have gathered up dust and other nuisance materials. Here we have a little bit of grease designed for doing helical threads, lens helicals in particular. It's called Helimax XP. It's a lithium grease, very light, very smooth consistency. That should just screw on nicely, anti-clockwise. Just running that down the thread a bit, that's good. And that can be held into place in the mount with 3 screws and washers. And the focus of the lens will be done on the camera body. Because the camera body's been serviced and tested, I know that the image at the film plane and the image at the focus screen agree, which means that to focus the lens I've only got to stick it in the camera body, and I can look, by looking through the viewfinder, I'll be able to see whether it focuses correctly or not. It's nice and smooth, so now I'm going to check that focus. So I'll check the alignment of those images in the finder rather, and see how it appears. Alright, I've had a quick look and it doesn't focus to infinity. So I'll just loosen the screws, move my focus ring back a bit, retighten the screws. They're just done up very lightly, they don't need to be tight. We're still doing the adjustment. Until I get my images to align correctly. No, still more required. Just a tiny bit. Just a tiny bit more. That's it. So I'm focusing that on an infinity target. Unfortunately, here I've only got to look out the window and I can see a good selection of targets on the horizon. The narrow lens is good, focused at infinity. The screws have just been snugged up. The name ring, which is also the bayonet mount for a lens hood, should go in. Seems to be a bit reluctant. That's it. And that's held in with that cone. Checking that that's all smooth, there's nothing rubbing, it's not loose, and I use a friction tool to snug that cone down into place. That's it, all done. And so that lens has been dealt to, stripped down, cleaned and ready to go, all adjusted, and that also marks the end of the service for that particular camera. Thanks for watching.